Hi everyone and welcome. So after my last video where we focused on small flies, specifically those down to size 24, I thought in this video I'd relax a little bit and try something substantially larger. So in this video I'm going to focus on two flies and specifically two life cycle stages of the UK's Ephemera Danica or Mayfly. That said, both of these patterns can cover a range of flies, not just Mayfly. So feel free to maybe switch up the color, the size to match the invertebrates on your waters. And as usual, if you would prefer not to listen to me baffle on, then feel free to use the chapters below, jump around and jump straight into the tying if you feel. Also, if you like the video, as usual, feel free to give it a like. And again, feel free to maybe consider subscribing to the channel, as that will help circulate the videos to the rest of the YouTube audience. So let's get into some big fly fun. So just like in the UK's early season hatches of March, Browns and Granham, the challenge isn't so much in tying the patterns, but rather making them stand out to a trout in the first place. Hatches can be huge, and because of the thousands of flies on the water, often appearing as flotillas of upwings, I find that sometimes going a little larger and giving the fish a bigger target can improve your chances in these larger hatches, as opposed to tying the flies to the exact size. The size of the naturals can differ considerably from catchment to catchment, so feel free to size accordingly. The Mayfly on my waters can range from size 14s or up to a monstrous size 10, but in this video I'll be tying both of the patterns in size 12s. During Mayfly time and any other large, big volume hatching fly, keep an eye on the water. The telltale sign of shucks in the surface film can sometimes be the indicator that a hatch is about to kick off. Of course, too many shucks in the water can also indicate that you're a little too late. Now, before we get into things, let's sidestep for a moment, and I want to apologise for stepping on my soapbox this time around. Sadly, siltation in our waters in the UK is now a big problem, more often than not caused by general bad farming mispractice. These farming practices can see crops planted closer and closer year on year to the water's edge, which sometimes leave little or no bankside vegetation, which, as we know, act as runoff barriers. Without these buffers, as we call them, runoff can and does increase siltation, covering riverbeds and suffocating the invertebrates that live there with silt and fertilizers. The invertebrates, of course, are our trout's primary food source. They aren't vegetarian and they don't eat salad. So if the food continues to be covered, the trout disappear. During the winter months, this runoff that I talk about can also cover salmon, sea trout and trout reds. And on some rivers where this siltation is very bad, we've actually lost generations of salmonid stocks. Losing a salmon red, of course, would be something, right? As we know, salmon numbers out at sea are decimated, so if they can even migrate back into their watercourses, that would be something. Add to this the increasing pressures of phosphate-rich pollution caused generally by chicken farming industry and the fertilizers, just to name two things, which increase carbon dioxide in our waters and actually cause huge algal blooms. Just take a look at the River Wye catchment in Wales and into the border of England, and you'll see our once fantastic salmon fishery has now been deemed, unfortunately, an ecological disaster. Now, there's some great work being done by a number of environmental parties, many of whom rely on data collected by us as the angling community. In case you're interested in some of these environmental activities, again, I'll share a few details in the description below. Now, on a slightly more positive note, Ephemera Danica, or the UK's Mayfly, is one species of upwing that actually needs a little silt. Now, it's these large mayflies that lay their eggs in the silt before emerging into their nymphal stage, and then again at the later stage as the subimago or dun. In the past 10 years, which is really a small amount of time, I've seen an enormous change and decline in invertebrate families within the River Usk and the Wye catchment. And in certain areas of the River Usk, Danica are now seen hatching at volume. And this was something that 10, 20 years ago was unheard of. So as river custodians, this isn't quite the balance that we'd like to see, but nature is fighting and we are seeing that increase in those mayfly families. So I'll step down from my soapbox for just a moment, however I won't apologize for that, and let's take a look at two patterns that I opt to use when targeting Danica feeding fish. Now, May and June are generally the best months for these large hatches, but of course we do see trickles and a few lonesome mayfly right through to September. Firstly, I use a lot of emerger style patterns when targeting any rising trout, which you can see at the bottom of this picture. These morsels are generally trapped in the surface film and are pretty easy pickings for a feeding trout. When trout then begin to target the dun stage of these invertebrates, I opt to use a more substantial pattern in the form of Philip White's Active Mayfly Dun, which you can see at the top of the picture. The duns themselves then can sit on the water surface for quite some time really, as they try to dry their newly emerged wings, so again, giving them something big and meaty to target can often work in our favour. So with that said, I'll talk about the specific patterns in a moment, but before we do, let's take a look at the fly tying materials. Firstly then, the hooks. Now, not only am I tying larger than usual patterns today, but takes during these huge hatches can be absolutely savage. The trout will literally clamber over one another in a fight for these larger morsels. For this, I need a strong hook that can take some punishment, so I'm tying both of today's patterns on Fulling Mill's Tatcical Big Bug model. Considering the tiny size 24 hooks that we discussed in the previous video, these size 12 hooks are massive in comparison, but very strong, and they can easily be utilized within dry fly patterns. Next, the thread. As always, I'll be using GSP style thread in this video, and specifically Nano Silk in my go-to 18/0 in white. As these are such big patterns though, 12/0 thread is also fine and will equate to little in the way of unneeded buildup. In terms of the materials, I'll be using a range of superfine style and natural dubbings, in today's case Fulling Mill's Tactical Dry Fly and Eco Warrior dubbings, pheasant tail fibers for tails, synthetic Shuck materials and maybe a little bling via some Krystal flash, multiple strands of traditional style tying thread as simple ribbing material, natural CdC and high quality rooster hackle for buoyancy, as well as deer hair for the wing on one of the patterns. So don't worry, I'm going to cover the specific materials when we get to each of the flies, but of course they're in the description below should you need them. And with that out of the way, let's take a look at two patterns that I like to use when targeting Danica feeding trout. Firstly, the CdC Mayfly Emerger. Much like my generic CdC March Brown Emerger, which I covered in a previous video, this Mayfly variant is simply a play on the generic or template style nature of the pattern. Change up the colour and size, and we have a simple but very effective Danica CdC Emerger, full of the emerging bits and bobs that make up this style, so attractive to trout and very productive for us, the anglers. So let's switch to the vise and tie the CdC Mayfly Emerger. So after mounting my hook in the vise, I'm going to tie on the thread and take it all the way down to the rear of the hook. And when ready, I'm going to take my Shuck material, I'm going to tie that in with a few secure wraps right on the top of the hook shank, and then I'm going to take my single strand of Krystal flash, and exactly the same way I'm going to tie that on top of the Shuck material this time. That's just giving us that nice amount of flash and hopefully that additional trigger for the feeding trout. And with the Shuck materials tied in, I'm going to take my thread in touch and turns all the way to the top of the hook or to the rear of the thorax. Now once our thread is at the rear of the thorax, we're ready for the ribbon material. As discussed earlier, this is a single strand of 12/0 thread, but folded over twice, so effectively giving us 4 strands. So I'm going to tie that in all the way back down to the Shuck. And at this point, we can start our body. So for this, I'm using the superfine style Tactical Dry Fly Dub. And for that, you can see here, I'm twisting that as tight as possible to give us that nice tapered effect. And I'm going to build up that body until I get the taper that I require. So pretty simple so far. And with that body or the tapered body created, I'm now going to twist those 4 strands of ribbing material, and then I'm going to rib in open wraps all the way up to the rear of the thorax. And then once at the rear of the thorax, simply tie off and tidy up. This step is purely optional. I like to rough up the body a little bit with a dubbing brush. This kind of teases out a few of those superfine style fibers, and I find that this gives the pattern somewhat of a more lifelike look, certainly when trying to replicate those gills that we see on the naturals. Now, as I say, purely optional. You don't have to do that, but I really like the way this looks when it fishes. Next, we're going to take our 4 CdC feathers, align the tips prior to measuring against the size of the hook. For me, for lengthwise, I like to offer that up to the hook and have it trailing by quarter of the pattern's full length. When ready, I'm just going to tie those in with a few secure wraps and then bring the thread forward towards the behind of the eye and then again tidy up. With the wing complete, I'm going to take my Eco Warrior dubbing and I'm going to create a dubbing noodle at the back of the thorax. With that, I'm going to wind forward and then wind back, so effectively 2 slim layers of thorax dubbing, and then I'm going to park my thread at the very rear again of the thorax. So as this pattern is a complete copy of my previously tied March Brown Emerger pattern, albeit the materials are slightly different, I'm going to go in with my already prepared CdC fibers. So this is effectively one side of a CdC feather parked in a bulldog clip, and then we insert that into a split thread and twist. When we're ready, I'm then going to bring that forward in open wraps towards the rear of the eye. The next step is purely optional, but I like to take my dubbing brush and lightly tease out and brush down those CdC fibers, and it also helps to maybe tease out a few of those buggy thorax fibers as well. And lastly, we'll bring forward the CdC feathers, tie down, whip finish, and remove our thread. For our final action, we just need to trim the shuck to length, and for this, I opt for a body length incise. And there we have it, a nice and simple CdC Mayfly Emerger. Next up is Philip White's Active Mayfly Dun, and in his brilliant book Observation, A Fly Fisher's Guide to Reading the Water, Philip White discusses reading the water, understanding rise forms, and understanding trout ecology. Phil then also introduces a range of Danica patterns, and the Active Mayfly Dun is one of my favourite patterns for targeting trout, feeding on duns or indeed spinners. Locally to me, it's become a go-to pattern within some groups, specifically those fishing in the river mono catchment, so much so that it's often lovingly referred to as the mono mayfly. If you've ever come across this pattern, know that it's Phil White's Active Mayfly Dun. In Phil's book, Phil states that this pattern was devised to represent newly hatched dun sitting on the water before its first flight. This is a fantastic pattern when targeting dun feeding trout, but in a bind, I've also used this during spinner falls too, and with much success. So let's jump into Phil White's Active Mayfly Dun. For our Active Mayfly Dun then, again I'm using the same Fulling Mill Tactical Big Bug, again in size 12. Here I've mounted the hook in the vise, and I've taken my GSP style thread, entered it and trimmed the tag. Once again, I'm going to take my thread, wrap it all the way down to the base or the curve of the hook. And then I will measure the tails, this time pheasant tail, to length, and I want these to be the size of the body. Now importantly, what we're doing here is tying the tails in, taking our thread around a quarter to a third of the way up the body before returning the thread back down to the base of the pattern. With our thread now parked at the base of the fly, or the rear of the fly, we're going to take our hackle pliers and wind the pheasant tail fibres all the way back down to the rear of the pattern, or the top of the tail. Once tied down, let's remove the tag ends. Now the next action might seem a little strange. I know it was to me when I first tied this pattern, but what essentially we're going to do is form a dubbing noodle and openly rib forward towards the top of that initial abdomen. This is going to give us both security on that fragile pheasant tail fibres, and it's also going to form a nice segmented profile. Note that I'm continuing to use that dubbing noodle to form a nice tapered body all the way up to the rear of the eye. For our hackle then, as discussed earlier, I'm using Whiting Farms Cree hackle. You can use Grizzle, that's fine, but I'm tying this in just behind the eye with a few secure wraps and then removing the tag end. Once the hackle's tied in, I'm going to take another dubbing noodle of the same dubbing material and I'm going to wind that back in nice touching turns, adding to that nice taper of the body and thorax. Then I'll park the thread just at the top of the pheasant tail fibres. Next, we're going to palm the fly, and for this I'm going to make 2 initial wraps at the throat of the fly before openly wrapping back towards the rear of the fly in open turns. Once there, I'm going to make a few secure wraps through the hackle. You'll notice I wiggle as I openly wrap through. This is going to give that hackle some nice security. And then eventually I'll ping off, or cut off if you prefer, the end of that hackle. Okay, so we're almost there. Next up is the wing, and for this I like to size it so that the wing length is just a little longer than the size of the body. I'll take 2 or 3 secure wraps to tie that down, then I'll part the deer hair, around about 50% of the deer hair, place 1 secure wrap through that deer hair, then bring my thread to the rear of the eye before whip finishing, tying off and removing the thread. Finally then, we will trim the deer hair, tidying that up and forming a nice head. And then very lastly, we'll go in with my scissors and we'll cut a V into the underside of the hackle. This is going to make this pattern sit perfectly every single time. And there we have it, the Active Mayfly Dun, or in some circles, the Mono Mayfly. This is an awesome, awesome pattern when targeting trout feeding on any sort of large dun, not necessarily mayfly. Philip White, you're a star. Thank you for a great pattern. So there we have it, 2 simple Danica or Mayfly patterns, both of which are quick and easy to tie and very effective when used in the right scenario. So feel free to give them a try, and more importantly, let me know how you get on. Feel free to drop a comment below or reach out to me via my website, GarethLewisFlyFishing.com. Lastly, and as always, feel free to give the video a like and maybe consider subscribing to the channel. Again, you'll be notified each time I create new content. So until next time, happy tying, Ikeda, and I'll see you soon.